The Brattlecast, that's where you are, and get set for some more fascinating information about books, old, new, rare, and out of print, and all the things related to it. I'm Jordan, and with me, of course, is Ken Gloss, the proprietor of the famous, around the world famous, Brattle Bookshop in Boston. You know, we've talked about all kinds of books, all kinds of genre. We've certainly covered some cookbooks in the past, but because they're cookbooks, there's so much you can dig into and there's so many places you can go. So today, another example.
There's tremendous. I mean, anytime you mention a subject, when someone says to me, I have children's books, I have history books, I have I immediately, I very nicely say, well, that's a huge subject. What type? How old? What are they? Is there something special? What... history books, I mean, that covers all of history. And when you get into cookbooks, I mean, a lot of times when I was in one of the last podcasts I did, I was saying I was going through a cubby and I pulled out a bunch of cookbooks, and there was the Walt Disney cookbook, there was the Baker Chocolate cookbook, there was the Mickey Mouse cookbook, there was a lot. Oh, there was the Gone with the Wind cookbook. I mean, in things of that type. And then I pulled one out, and it said the Women's Suffrage cookbook.
Well, this I want to hear more about. I want to see it too, but I want to hear more about it.
It's done in the 1880s.
Okay, during the height of the push for suffrage,
as it was really getting going.
Right.
And one of the things that's happened with book collecting and collectors and libraries and institutions, but also collectors, is there's a lot of areas that were very collectible, but now because of the internet, a lot of that information is easily available and it's not as collected because you don't need the books for the information or for the students. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the libraries now are looking for areas that maybe were not as collected before, that maybe left gaps in the knowledge, that with women's rights, with gay rights, with a lot of others, they say these have been neglected. So that people are saying, gee, that would be an interesting area to collect. And obviously with women's suffrage, it's a very serious and very much an area. But when you get into I didn't think of women's suffrage cookbooks. And one of the things I also found fascinating, I mean, you go through and the recipes are recipes. This was my guess is that this was a lot like institutional, an MF Museum of Fine Arts cookbooks, where the people sell the book to help the organization. And I'm sure the funds of selling them probably to a lot of, and they probably had a built-in audience to buy it because all of the people who contributed to it. But I even see someone here, it's interesting because they put pins in with little cutouts from newspapers over recipes. Maybe they liked the newspaper recipe more than they liked the...
Isn't that interesting? Wow.
And cookbooks are fascinating to read through because cookbooks in many times gives you a lot of insight into the society, into what people could have, into the technology, refrigeration. The other thing that I found that you're actually looking at right now is the advertising. Now, just think about it. If back then it was a very controversial subject, so whoever was putting ads in this probably got some flack from a lot of people saying, I'm not in favor of women's voting in suffrage.
Sure. But they also, as you know, when it comes to advertising, they have to know their audience. So it's standard goods, mustard, spices, extracts, ladies' lunch catering.
Exactly.
Wow.
And I saw the one on ladies' lunch catering, and I thought, well, maybe with the meetings of the suffrage.
Exactly. Yeah, that makes sense.
And then, of course, right now in Broadway, there's a play, the Suffrage, a musical.
It's called Suffs, yeah. Right.
But then I find it interesting that you start looking who contributed to it, what the recipes were, what was going on, how many of these women, even though they were for suffrage, was it sort of the standard stay-at-home cook, or were these women better educated and standard stay-at-home and tell the cook how to cook? Because that's what happened an awful lot too. But I think when I put this book away originally, it was probably 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And my guess is that 20 years ago, I probably would have priced this book a few $100s. I mean, because it's an interesting subject and unusual. Mm-hmm. You don't see them. When we pulled this out, one of my people I work with at the store was going through a lot of the stuff. I pulled out box after box after box of stuff. And, of course, then it's all sitting on a two-wheeler. And someone said, well, okay, it's out of the cubby, but we can't just leave it on the floor. So they decided that they were going to go through things, look this up, and they found a copy available at about $4,500.
Wow.
My guess is that that's a little bit outrageous price-wise, but I'd be thrilled with half of that.
I'm looking on page, well, it's not even the start of the book officially. Yeah. It's in the preview section. The Woman's Journal, a weekly newspaper published every Saturday in Boston, devoted to the interests of women. Now, this, again, 1880s, right?
Yep.
And occasional contributors include, no big names, Louisa M. Alcott. There was another one here that struck me, Julia Ward Howe.
Oh, yes.
I mean, there's some heavy hitters here.
Yeah, and you can see who was supporting the suffrage.
Sure, yeah.
And this was published in Boston, so it tended to be a Boston area. Right. And probably it would be fascinating to just go down and look the names and the history of the other people who were involved in this and imagine the groups and the societies. Now, particularly Julia Ward Howe, it probably to some degree was the cook
right.
Who would be putting a lot of this together. But cookbooks are fascinating. You go and you see how things were cooked. You see one of the two huge things in this era that were happening is ice was easily available. And not refrigerators at that time, but ice, which allowed for refrigeration, which allowed for storing things a while. You'd have an ice box. Also, the stove was coming in more. Now, not the stove that we know now where you set it to 420 degrees.
Not the convection oven.
But you'd look at it in either coal or wood, and a lot of times you'd look at the coal and wood, and by the color and the light and the way it was burning, you could tell how hot it was. But those new inventions were coming in, and what people could cook at home. Now, it still was many times what would happen is many times the man of the house would maybe be going with these people going from Beacon Hill or so on to work, but they'd be passing by a place like Quincy Market. They'd pick up the meal maybe for the next day, give it to the cook. Also, when you go into a lot of these houses in the Beacon Hill and the Back Bay area or the wealthier areas of almost every city, the main floors, there's no kitchen.
Right, downstairs.
Everything's in the basement.
Where the servants' quarters were.
Servants' working quarters were in the basement.
Yeah.
Servants' quarters tended to be up on the top floor.
Right.
It was basically the attic because, quite honestly, they were hot.
They were hot. I used to live in the South End for a short time in one of those buildings from 1859. And indeed, the basement was where the kitchen was originally.
Yeah.
And there was a fourth floor up a spiral staircase that was, without AC, hotter than you know what.
Well, but,
so I understand completely, and that's Boston.
But I love this when you start seeing.
Yeah.
I mean, the other things that you were just pointing out, where Louisa May Alcott has a recipe in this.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that this would get a better price is there are lots of avid collectors of Little Women and of everything Louisa May Alcott put out. Just the fact that she contributed to this really adds to the value.
Wow.
A lot. So it's fun because, again, I stuck a cubby away. It's sort of like going through the attic or the basement of a house and pulling things out. And the hard part for me was almost everything there I put into that cubby because it was interesting. And then I'm realizing, wait a minute, I haven't looked at this in 15 years. Most of it probably can go. And the other sideline to that is Now I have a lot of space in that cubby that I can fill up again.
With more interesting
With
stuff.
more that I can look at in 15 years from now.
Well, don't forget, folks, the Brattlecast is a production of the Brattle Bookshop, brattlebookshop.com. And for those of you who want to connect with Ken and raise a subject, and it seems amazing that you'll be able to find one we haven't done yet, but there are many subjects, right?
Every book was done because somebody thought it would be interesting. So
Yeah.
it covers every subject in the world. And so, yes, there are many subjects we haven't done.
This is the podcast for the truly curious and those who want to keep learning and have fun. Thank you, Ken, as always.
It's fun, and that's one of the great things about bookstores, people who come into the store, myself, is almost everybody who's interested in books is interesting, and then thus fun and talkable. I won't say 100%. I'll say almost everybody.
Close enough for jazz.
Yeah.
Close enough for jazz. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening to the Brattlecast.